Hello everyone and welcome to this week's extension tutorial. In this one, it's going to be a full-length development tutorial on creating an extension to load up your scripts as buttons that you can execute. We're going to be going over everything from the prerequisites you need, the programs to use, how to conceptualize things, getting started and what steps to take, how to debug, and then of course how to package and send out your product for other people to test. Now, there aren't technically any total prerequisites to be able to code extensions, but it does very much help if you know JavaScript extended to create scripts for After Effects and Premiere, and also to know the basics of HTML, CSS, XML, and JavaScript. Running extensions is very JavaScript heavy, so that's going to be something you want the most proficiency in because you'll be using a lot of it to do things inside of both HTML and to run the scripts to do functionality inside of the Adobe application of your choice. And before I dive straight in, I just want to mention that an extension is different from a script in that it is one of these dockable type things you see all over After Effects, and essentially it's an HTML panel using HTML to communicate with a script in order to have nice visuals, and then communicate using the scripting language of your choice. And this will allow you to have a nicer UI than a regular script, but not as much power as, say, a plugin. So you'll definitely want to know JavaScript Extended or JSX, the scripting language for Adobe programs. I have a plethora of tutorials which you can check out in the link in the description below, and you can also check out other videos online or through the guides. Another helpful resource is if you're just starting to learn coding of any kind or scripting, you want to check out some courses on HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, because these will be the main things we'll be using to design and make some basic functionality of the extension with. And then lastly, before we jump into doing some prerequisite things to get the extension set up to work, we want an application to edit things in. For scripts specifically, you can use whatever you want to edit, any language really, but I prefer Extend Script for Adobe scripts, as well as you can also use Visual Studio Code, which is free and has some support for that as well now. And of course you can use Visual Studio Code or Sublime or any application you want to edit all your HTML, JavaScript, and that sort of thing. And today we're going to be using the extension test that I've been using for all the tutorials this month, and I've gone ahead and basically stripped out all of the useful code in it so we can basically start from scratch with this template and build it up from there. The first thing we're going to do is open up Command Prompt and set things up so that we can have full sort of administrator access and debugging privileges to work with extensions. Typically, when you install an extension on your system, it's been signed by a trusted source and packaged up in such a way that your computer will run it just fine. But when we're developing extensions, we need to sort of release any restrictions we have so that we can run an extension no matter what and find out what the bugs are. So there's two different ways you can do this. If you're on Windows, you want to use regedit.exe, and if you're on a Mac, you want to use the terminal. And then to enable this setting on our Windows machine, we'll go under Current User, Software, Adobe, and then we have our CSXS folders. CSXS refers to the CEP library, or the communication between the Adobe scripting side and the HTML panels that we'll be developing. You'll have different versions depending on which version of After Effects you have installed, but what we'll want to do for each version is make sure we go into the Player Debug Mode tag and we set the data to be 1. So all you have to do is double click on it and change the value to 1, and it will have that setting enabled that will allow us to run any extension without any special permissions. If you have this set to 0, it's set as the default. If you have it set to 1, it's sort of set to ignore any licensing or security. So once you've gone ahead and changed all of those, you'll be good. And of course, when you change those, you'll need to restart any applications you have open. Now, if you're on a Mac, you want to go into your terminal and type it in manually by saying defaults write com.adobe.csxs your version number, and then say player debug mode 1. And you'll also want to do this for versions 4 through 9, 4 through 10, whatever you have at the time of this video is being watched. And as soon as you do it for each of the versions, it will basically enable you to use any version of After Effects that supports extensions and run those extensions freely without the privilege problems you could have. And there's one last prerequisite you need before we can get started writing our extension, and that is motivation and time. The learning curve for writing extensions can be extremely difficult, and I've been doing it for only 2 or 3 years and I'm still learning things all the time because you're dealing with multiple programming languages, interactions through them, making sure the data structures are working properly in them, and many other difficult things that you may not be familiar with, or certain things that are specific to Adobe that you have to learn. And you can get very far with just a bit of motivation. If you have an idea and you work incrementally, step by step towards reaching that goal, not only will you learn a lot, you'll also have a finished product in the end that you can use. Alright, so the first step in making an extension is to have an idea. Now my idea is relatively simple. We're going to have an extension that loads up all of the scripts inside of a given folder and populates a list of buttons from top to bottom. And all we have to do is click on that button and it's going to load up the script and run it as it normally would. So this is going to require us to design a basic UI, some CSS to style it, some JavaScript to handle the buttons, and then some JavaScript extended script for Adobe After Effects to essentially look into wherever the information is being given and run the scripts that we've selected. So that's our starting point. Let's go ahead and jump into some of these files. If you haven't already, you'll want to download the extension from GitHub in the description down below. And inside of here, you're going to see an index.html file on the root, and then some CSS files inside of the CSS folder, CSXS, which contains our manifest file, which basically defines how the extension is going to appear and run in different programs. You can include things like fonts, your JavaScript extended for running the scripts, as well as any other folders like for containing presets or pre-made assets for logos and things like that. The folder structure doesn't really matter as long as you use folder names you can remember and reference when including them in your different programming files. So the first file we're going to take a look at is the manifest.xml, which is important before starting everything. This file contains all of the information such as the version, the bundle name, and all of the versions and Adobe programs this is going to run in. It also contains a lot of useful information like the files that will need to be included, at least the main files like the HTML file it will load on startup. But if you take a look at the broken down bare bones XML file here, we have our com.extension testing. Our bundle ID is important when we're going to be packaging things up in later. We have our bundle version, which you can set to whatever you want depending on where you are in development. And of course the bundle name, which we're just going to call extension testing in this case. Then in the extension list tags, we have our panel defined here with its own ID. So we're just going to call it the same name as the extension.panel. And then a very important place is under the execution environment and host. You can add all the hosts you want for any Adobe programs. And for our case, we want the program named Adobe After Effects. And we can specify the version number, the minimum version number that we'll run in our case, Adobe After Effects version 12. If we wanted to say add another one, we could simply copy and paste it and say if we want this to work in Premiere Pro, just type in P Pro and select whichever minimum version you'd like. If you do make any changes to this XML file, you will need to restart the application you're running the extensions in order for it to be updated. The only other things we need to look at would be the required runtime and some of the other information. Under required runtime, this is the version of CSXS or the CS library we're going to be using. If you go into the JavaScript folder and libs, you can see I have my csinterface.js, which is very important. And you can see we have the version number displayed here, but inside the manifest, we can specify the minimum version required. But for the most part, these CSXS versions don't vary much from version to version. Then we're going to have a list of all of our dispatch info. Again, we're going to put in our ID for our extension panel. And then under resources, this is very important. When looking at our XML file, we need to reference the main path to the HTML file. This is going to be one folder up, so we go there. And then it's called index.html, which is perfect. If the folder was, say, inside of here, we could remove that folder going up right there, and it would recognize that just fine. Then I have the same thing for my After Effects file, which is going to be running the script code. It's going to be a level up inside of the JSX folder, and it's called AfterEffects.jsx. Then the last few things, we're going to set the auto visibility of our extension to be true to make sure it appears on run. We're going to set the type to be a panel, but you can also set other types like a mode list type, which will appear differently. And the menu is just going to be called extension testing. This is the title that will be displayed at the top of your extension. And you can see the extension testing name is just up here. And then lastly, you can set some things like the height and width. And these will be the defaults that it loads up on. So if I were to close my extension and reopen it, the default height and width is going to be 580 by So now that we're done with the manifest.xml file, the setup is all good. We should have our extension now being able to appear, given that you have the files in the right location and the right references. So now let's go ahead and code our HTML and CSS to both make the basic designs and functionality of this script. If you look inside the HTML file, you can see there's a bunch of JavaScript code at the beginning here. Don't worry about this, as this is just sort of template code I use in order to make sure the user can't right-click on the window, because if I was to say remove this, what's going to happen when I rerun the extension, if I right-click on it, you can see it's going to bring up options like print or view page source. We don't really want that, so I have all this code to basically disable that ability, and we can add custom right-clicks later if we want. So our main HTML code needs to go inside of our body, and I have an area for JavaScript inside of our body, so I'm going to make sure my HTML is before that. The first thing I'm going to do is make a divider or a div to make sure all of our buttons can be contained in something manageable. So I'm going to create a div, and I'll set the ID to button holder. Then I'll make sure I close that div out, and inside of here we're going to try and put all of our buttons. Just for testing purposes, we're going to create a button. We'll call it ID equals test button. And this button text is just going to say this is a test button. And then we'll make sure we close that out. And now if we go ahead and close and rerun our extension, after we've saved it of course, you can see we have this is a test button. And this is sort of the basic format we're going to want to follow. We're going to want to create a bunch of these buttons based on some file folders or file names, and then obviously we're going to want some style changes like it to be centered, maybe different size or different font, things like that. So what I'm going to do is also give this a class and just call it a script button. That way, because I'm going to create a whole bunch of these, I can reference them all to the same class and have a bunch of different script buttons and easily control the style of them. So the way we're going to do this now, we're going to set up a basic style for this button type. We have a script button class. So I'm going to go into my CSS and say dot script button. The way we reference classes, of course, is by using the period identifier. If you want to refer to a specific ID, for example, this specific button is called the test button, you can use the hashtag and then the name of the ID. So for our script button, let's go ahead and change a few things. First, I'm going to set the width to be something I default set, so let's say 250 pixels, and for the height, let's set it to maybe 30 pixels. Then another thing I can do is maybe change the background color to red, just so we can see the difference here. And when we relaunch the extension, you can see the background color is now red, and it's a little bit bigger as the button. Another thing I want to do is whenever the user hovers the button, I want to have it have the little hand icon like you're about to select it. So in order to do that, I'm going to say script button and then hover. This is a way we can use the hover attributes. You could also say script button active for whenever they click on it. And when they hover over it, I want to set the cursor to be something new, and that's going to be called a pointer. And I'm not going to keep this background color red, but I might change it to like a nice dark color, like something like 30. And let's take a look at that. So we've got a pretty dark looking button, but now you can see when we hover over it, it has a nice different mouse icon. Let's go ahead and do one more thing and change the opacity of the button when we hover over it. So we're going to set the starting opacity with the normal class here. We're going to set it to be like 0.7 out of 1. And then when we hover over it, we're going to bring it up all the way to 1. And I'm going to go ahead and make this background even lighter. You can see we have our new button that's going to have a little bit more dynamics to it when we hover over it and then click on it. I'm going to do one more thing to the buttons and make the color of the text just be white. That way it's a little bit more legible and readable. And then I'm also going to grab the divider that's holding everything, or the button holder. So I'm going to say hashtag button holder, and what we can do is define a width and height inside of here, and I'm going to set this to be the same as we set in our manifest. So if I load up our manifest here, I have 400 by 580. So I'm going to say the width is 400 pixels and the height 580 pixels. Then, so we can see where this actual div element is, I'm going to set the background color to something bright like blue, and save and restart the extension. So now you can see we have our button here, and our entire div has now been colored blue. You can see the size is set in place to be this big. The next thing I want to do is make sure these buttons are going to be centered, just to make it look a little bit nicer. And in order to do that, I'm going to say, I think, text align center, which should align all of the elements within it to be centered. So now we have it centered, and any other elements we add, other buttons or things, are going to be placed directly in the center. If you haven't guessed already, one of the basic and easiest ways to debug extensions is to just make a change to the code that's very dramatic, like changing the background color to blue, and then seeing what it looks like when you update it and save it and open up the extension. So maybe we want a nice, instead of a background that's really bright and blue, let's make a border, and I'll set the border width to be like 3 pixels, and the border color, let's set it to be white. And this is a good time when you're not sure if you've coded something right, you can just Google it, which is a lot of the process is finding things on Stack Overflow or W3 Schools. So I'll just type in CSS border. Let's go ahead and set the border style first. And let's set it to be dashed, because that looks pretty interesting. And now, as you can see, we have a nice bordered section inside of our extension, which is going to contain all of our buttons. I'm going to make it a little bit less noticeable by changing the color here, and let's make the width really small. Alright, so that looks pretty good. One more thing we might do is add a bit of padding, because we're going to have multiple buttons here. If I were to say add a few more test buttons and then reload the extension, you can see they're just stacked on top of each other. It doesn't look that great. So let's add some padding inside of the CSS. Referring to each of our script buttons, I'm going to add some padding top. We'll make it about 10 pixels, and then I'll do the same for the padding bottom, make it 10 pixels. And it looks like that's not correct. Let's try margin. And there we go. As you can see, sometimes it just takes a little bit of toying around to get things looking the way you want. So that is basically all we're going to do for the HTML and CSS portion. We might jump back into it in a little bit in order to fix some things if we see some problems. But in general, you want to use the HTML and CSS first, just to do the basic design before we start implementing all of the interactions between programming languages and applications. So we have these test buttons. We're not actually going to be using these inside of the HTML. We're just using it to do basic development. We're now going to move on to coding the JavaScript to interact with all of this and generate our buttons, as well as the JavaScript extended to actually go into our file system and look up what script files we have, as well as initiate those script files. So inside of our main.js, we just have a very skim, basic amount of code here. Inside of here is basically going to be the initial function that runs when we launch our script. So we just have a path set up here, which checks if you're on a Windows or a Mac. And I accidentally deleted this getOS function, so I'm just going to bring that back in. So it's going to run the getOS function, check if you're on a Mac or a Windows, and get the path. Sometimes this can vary, so I separated it out. But if we want to check to make sure our variable of our path is valid, we're just going to say alert path in the JavaScript. So when we run this, it should load up our extension like normal, run through this basic bit of code, and alert what our path is. And in this case, the path should reference the path of the HTML file, and we're just cutting off part of the length of it. So we'll go ahead and launch our extension, and we're going to get the path here. Now we can't see all of it, but we can see it goes up into the extensions folder, which, if I didn't already mention or put as a subtitle or something, the extensions folder is where you want everything to be tested from, which on Windows is under Program Files 86, your common files, Adobe, CEP extensions. This is where you'll find all the other extensions as well that you have installed, and on Mac it's going to be under your Application Support, Adobe, CEP extensions. So now that we have that path, we need to get more information as to what the path is, because we can't see it all. So I'm going to slice the string of the path, start the slice at like 60 and go all the way to the path length, or the end of the path. Then we'll relaunch our extension and see what it is. So it looks like our path ends with extension testing. If you see this %20, this is just means a space, which we can remove later if it causes problems. But that's referring to our extension testing folder, which is right here. So our path is equivalent to this entire path right here, which is very useful as we're going to put in our JavaScript presets inside of our presets folder. So I have this folder full of JavaScript files, and these are all the files we're going to convert and load into being buttons, which we can click on and execute them as files. So we know that we're inside of our extension testing folder. We need to go into the presets folder within that. It goes extension testing and presets, where all of our files are located. So we're going to want to keep track of that. So what I'm going to say is path plus equals presets, and that should give us the whole path of our extension testing plus presets. Now we're going to create an object which is called the CS interface object, which is what we use to interact between this HTML panel and any scripts we want to run, or in our case, our After Effects.jsx file. So what I'm going to do is create a new variable called interface. You can call it whatever you want, but just realize we need a variable name to represent this object that's going to be communicating between things. And we're going to create a new CS interface. It needs parentheses because it is an object you're creating. And I released a whole quick tip tutorial on useful CS interface methods, such as evaluating scripts, loading and closing extensions, getting ID names, getting extension names, getting the size of the extension. There's plenty of information you can get by using this. What we need to do is just say interface dot, and anything we put in here can be the methods that are included. If you want a full list, you can go into the CS interface file, and all of these methods here are the ones we can use. Get host capabilities, get application ID. Again, there's a whole tutorial I made on this. We're going to be using Eval Script, which is going to allow us to communicate with a JavaScript extended file. And what we're going to do inside of Eval Script, inside Eval Script, we're going to enclose everything in single quotes. The first thing we're going to do is we need to have a function inside of our JavaScript extended file that's going to basically get all of our JSX file names or the paths. So we're just going to call it a function and call it getJSXFiles. And remember, we're going to need our path to that presets folder. So we're just going to use an argument called path. And when we get in here, we're going to alert the path to make sure the data is being transferred all the way through. So inside Eval Script, the script we're going to want to run, or the script function we're going to want to run, is called getJSXFiles, and we're going to need the path. But the issue here is that the path is not part of this single quoted string. It needs to be the variable called path, otherwise it will mess up. So what I'm going to do is make sure that is outside of our quotes here, and we're going to add this right in between. We're going to add the path string, and this will pass it as a string argument. But we don't want to stop just here. I'm going to go ahead and, after we've closed out our parenthesis here, we're going to give it another argument. We're going to say function results, and that's going to be equal to something new here. We'll make sure we close out our eval script function, and now what we need to do inside of here is we're going to return a value. So in order to return a value from our JavaScript extended file, we need to give our eval script two arguments. The first argument is the name of our function and any of the arguments we're giving it, so in this case getJSXFiles, and the second is sort of the function in which it's going to return a variable with. So the second argument is function res, and we're going to need a variable for all of our sort of new paths to our JSX files. So I'll go ahead and say var paths is equal to an empty array, and I'm going to say paths is equal to json.parse, and we're going to parse the result or our function res here. What this function res sort of stands for is whatever is returned from this function we're running right here. So after this, we're going to we could return our path again, and it would turn that into our paths. But we're not quite there yet. We're going to fill it up with an array of files. And if you're not familiar, the reason we're going to be using JSON is because it's an interchangeable JavaScript data structure that we can use both in our script and our JS files. So you'll see in the After Effects.jsx file there is an include JSON too, and this is just to make sure we have compatibility between the two. Our path here to our presets folder with all of our JavaScript extended files. We're creating an empty array called paths to store all of those files we're going to get back from our JavaScript extended file. And then we're using the CS interface Eval Script to evaluate this function and return a result and set our path variable equal to that result. And it doesn't seem like we're getting inside of here. I think I forgot to save it. Let's try it again. And now's the time where we kind of have to troubleshoot. Troubleshooting JavaScript can be very difficult because if you're missing, say, a semicolon or one thing is spelled by one letter off, by a capital letter or something, it could take you an hour to find it if you don't take it incrementally sometimes. So I think what we need to do is enclose our path in double quotes. Let's try that. And finally, I think I just realized restarting the application was the solution. So, as you can see, a lot of crazy testing can happen sometimes. Restarting the application seemed to have worked. I did change the name of interface to CS interface, but I should be able to change that back now. But now inside of our JSX, we're getting the alert for the path here, which is referring to our common files, CEP extensions, extension testing, and presets. So again, the issue seemed to be that I needed to restart the application. I must have made some changes in the manifest file that I forgot to update. Like I said, it's required pretty much that you change that. So I'm going to uncomment all of this and let's make sure it still runs. And actually let's make sure we get into our JavaScript extended file and get those alerts. Alright, so now I've restarted After Effects and it looks like we're getting into here. We got our test, our path to our presets folder, and then back in here we're getting test again. And then I'm going to create a folder object, say folder, and it's going to be to our path. And I want to first make sure this folder .exists. If this tells me true, then I know that that is our actual presets folder and it's a valid location. So we get true, and we can probably remove these other alerts for now. And now what we're going to want to do is loop through our folder files and get all of the JavaScript extended files. So I'm going to create a for loop starting at 0 for I is less than our folder.getFiles.length, increment I by 1. And actually what we can do is use our files variable here to put that in, and then we'll say JSX files is going to be our empty array that we're going to fill now. So then we'll say files.length, and for each time through we're going to check if the file contains the extension JSX. So if our files or our current file.name contains the index of .jsx and that does not equal -1, which means that the JSX text is contained after -1, so it's anywhere from 0 to the end of the string, then we're going to take our JSX files and push files I. And we're actually going to push the fs name, which references the entire path to that file, because when we shoot it back into the program here in JavaScript, we don't have the same file objects necessarily to deal with, so we're going to give it the path, which everyone can understand. Then I'm going to alert our JSX files to make sure we're getting that variable correctly. Run the extension, and it says line 4 is undefined. So we'll go check out line 4, and that's our folder.getFiles. We forgot to define the folder before we call it. So now we'll rerun it again, and you can see we're going to get a massive array. This is full of all of our JSX files. We have all of the script names and paths, which is great. So we're going to return those JSX files, which is again just the paths to those files. But what we want to do is use JSON to make sure we're getting the right format. So I'm going to say json.stringify. We know it's a big array full of strings. We're going to stringify that array so that we can, when we bring it back in here, parse it. So now if we go back into our JSX, and after we've filled in our paths with the return of this JSX files function, which is going to be again all of these paths we just had displayed, we're going to alert our paths. We want to know that our paths are being returned past this point in the code. And I already know the outcome, but it should alert nothing. This is because of asynchronicity of scripting. Basically what that means is that these JavaScript extended files are running on a different time frame as JavaScript. There's no waiting going on. So what we need to do is manually tell it to wait. In order to do that, we're going to set a timeout with a function. So we're going to say set timeout and run this function for the timeout. But we also need to go ahead and close out the timeout function and give it a second argument. The first argument for the timeout is the function to run. So we're going to create a little pseudo function which we can throw in even more stuff inside of. But the second argument is how many milliseconds to wait. So we're just going to wait like 2,000 milliseconds just to show you. And then instead of alerting the paths afterward, we're going to alert the paths after we've waited in this timeout. The reason we're going to wait is because our JavaScript extended file is going through and finding the files it needs. So we'll go ahead and save that and run it. Now if we wait 2 seconds, one thing I forgot to do is re-enable our paths here. We need this to be a variable that we can fill. But now if we go ahead and save it and run it, we wait 2 seconds and then we get this alert with all of our paths. So you can see it's cut off a little bit because that's how alerts work in this JavaScript. But the first one is our callout a.test.jsx, and the rest are going to be all of our JSX files. So any other code we want to run that needs these paths needs to be in this timeout function. And 2,000 seconds or 2,000 milliseconds is too long. We could just say 300 and it should be fine. So you can see if I maybe say alert paths index 0, the first path, and then run it, you can see much quicker now. We're still going to get the information while we wait 300 milliseconds, and we're going to have all of the paths to these items. Alright, now we're going to create a function called generate buttons outside of this main anonymous function that runs here. I'm going to say function generate buttons, and we're going to want all of our paths, but the name is already used up here, so let's call it something different. We'll say script paths, and inside of here we're just going to run through and create all of our buttons using these paths here. So I'm going to call the function generate buttons and give it our paths. And now you could do something like, to make sure you're getting the script paths in here, just do a loop. So I'll say for var I is equal to 0 and I is less than our script paths.length I++, and each time we're going to tell it to alert us the current script path. So we should get a list of a bunch of script alerts here. Sometimes this many alerts can be silly, but it shows that it's working. So you can see we're going to get a bunch of alerts with each of the names of our scripts that is loading inside of our folder. So we know that data is being transferred in here. Now we're just going to use this for loop to make a button each time it runs through and sees one of those new script paths. So I'm going to create a few variables. The first one is going to reference our holder div that we used, our button holder. So I'm going to say var button holder is equal to our document, referring to our whole HTML document, and we're going to get an element by its ID, and the ID we're going to get it by is called button holder. So now we have a variable to represent that div. We're going to use it to fill it now. We need an empty variable called this button, I think would be a good name. And then all we're going to do is say, for each time we run through and have a new path, this button is equal to our document, and we're going to create an element. The element is a button type. We're just going to be recreating these buttons right here. So we need to tell it it's a button type. We can give it an ID if we want to, and we can also give it a class. So what I'm going to do is fill the ID with the path to the script, and I'll give it the class script button. So I'm going to say this button dot set attribute, so we can set an HTML attribute. The attribute is going to be the class, and the class name is going to be script button. Then we're going to need to give it an ID, which I'm again going to set to be the path. So I'm going to say ID, and that's going to be equal to our script paths I. And just to make sure it's a string, I'm going to say .toString because it is coming from a parsed stringified variable. Then we need to set an onClick function, so when the user presses it, it's going to activate something. So usually in HTML you would just say onClick is equal to a function, and you could pass the button itself by saying that, and then we could reference this.id to get the path. But since we're setting it up in JavaScript, what we're going to do is do another set attribute. So you get really good at setting attributes here. We're going to set it to be an onClick function, and the function we're going to just call it, needs to be in quotes here, button click, and we need to pass this. Now in this case we can pass this without separating it out and having it separate here because it's just referencing the element itself. So anytime we click on the button, it's going to run a function called button click, which I'm going to define right here, and the this is going to be called the button element because we're bringing in that button element, and each time I'm just going to alert the button element.id to make sure we're getting that whole path. And then lastly, to add this element to our button holder div, we're going to say button holder div.append child, and the child we're going to append or add is the this button variable. So now I'm going to go ahead and delete these buttons right here. And one thing we forgot is to set the inner HTML, but we'll do that in a second. We just want to make sure that these buttons are now going to populate. So now you can see we have a giant list of buttons that's extending past our div, which we'll fix as well with a scroll bar. But now we have all of our buttons. If we click on one, we're going to get the path to the JavaScript extended file itself, which we're going to then send into another scripting function to run it. So as you can see, we need to add the names for this. I'm going to go ahead and do a trick here. I'm going to take the name of this whole ID and just cut out the name after the slash and before the .jsx. In order to do that, I'll create a variable called this name. And each time I'm going to set this name equal to, it'll be our script paths, I. Then we're going to want to further parse that by saying this name is equal to itself, and we're going to slice out a part of it. The part we're going to slice is after this last slash and before our .jsx. So the start point of that slice is going to be this name dot last index of slash there, which you need to put in 2 for it to work as a string. And then the ending is going to be this name dot length -4. Now I'm going to go ahead and alert this name. It might appear a bunch of times, but that's fine for testing. Actually, we don't need to alert it. What we can do is simply say this button dot inner HTML is equal to this name. So it's going to fill in the text of that button with whatever this name is going to be. So if we go ahead and run it, you can see now we're getting a whole list of things here. What I think we're going to do is change it up a little bit to include the JSX extension so they know it's a script, as well as we still have a slash in there. So I'm going to say +1 to the last index of the slash, and I'm going to remove the -4. So this should give us the full name of the JavaScript file. So now if we run it, you can see we're getting a whole list of all of those there, and if we click on it, we're still going to get the accurate whole path. Alright, all I think that's left for the main bit of the script here is to add a scroll bar and to add the running functionality to actually run these scripts. So inside of our button click, we're just going to copy and paste our CS interface code here and reuse it. I might call it something different here. And this time we're going to make a function called run script, and it's going to require the script path. And just to make sure, we're going to alert the script path whenever we come in here. But now we need to update the script name here to be run script instead of get the JSX files. And instead of passing the path, we're going to pass the button element.id. And one other thing is we don't need to return a function or return a value from this function. So I'm going to remove the second argument and just have it give it this argument and run that. So let's go ahead and save it and try to run it again. Now when we click on a button, you can see we're going to get this alert. You can see we're not getting any of the slashes or anything, so let's go ahead and see if we can fix that. If we go ahead and alert our button element.id, let's see what it's giving us before it passes into the JavaScript extended. So it's giving us this single slash here, which if you remember up here, when we sliced it by this backslash or forward slash, whichever one it is, we need to put in 2 because 2 equals 1. So because we're only giving it 1, when we're going to the JavaScript, it's totally removing that. So what I'm going to do is grab the ID and say .replace, and we're going to replace any single slash globally with 2 slashes. And actually, just to make sure this is working before we send it in, I'm going to alert our button element ID again and see if that gives us a valid value. Go ahead and run it. When we click on one, you can see we're now going to have 2 slashes instead of the 1. And when we send it into the JavaScript, it's not updated yet because we need to put in this replace. But now that we know it's working, I think we should get it to bring it in properly to the JavaScript extended. So we'll go ahead and save and run it. Now when we click on it, you can see we're getting the proper path inside of our JavaScript. So now all that's left to do is add one more line of code here. We're going to create a script file variable. Set this equal to a file with our script path. And now what we're going to want to do is reference our global class of objects here, and we're going to want to eval a file. So we're going to say $.eval file, and the file we're going to evaluate is our script file. So now if I go ahead and save it and run it, let's go ahead and click on one of our scripts here. You can see when I click on it, it's going to load up any potential UI it has or start running any functions that it has built into it. So you can see I can click on any of these and it's going to run it as if it was running the actual script. So awesome, we know that's working. What's left to do? Well, we could add a scroll bar to this div here because we can't scroll past that. So what we'll do for that is go into our button holder here and say scroll, and we'll say overflow X and overflow Y. And if I go ahead and check out the W3 schools, I forget if X is horizontal or vertical, so I'm just going to check it out here. And it looks like X is left and right. So we're going to set overflow X to hidden and overflow Y to scroll. And what this should do when we relaunch it is enable us to scroll all the way to the bottom of this list of buttons. As you can see, now we can have access to any amount of those files we have in there. You can see there might be a few problems with too long of names, but you can go in and change like the font size and things like that. But now we have a full list of all of these scripts that it's automatically read from a folder. So that's the total coding from beginning to end of all the JavaScript, JavaScript extended, CSS, HTML, and all that fun stuff. Now all that's left to do is prepare this for distribution, which I've already made a few tutorials on, but I'm going to go ahead and briefly explain the process again. If you haven't already seen my tutorial on the 3 types of installers you can basically make for people, we're going to be going over briefly those 3 methods, a Zxp file, as well as a Mac and a Windows installer. Regardless of which way you choose to distribute your extension, you'll need these files that are inside of here. And you'll need some sort of organization to help the process go more smoothly. So essentially what I'm going to do is find my folder where I have Zxp signed CMD. If you're not familiar with Zxp Sign CMD, you can simply go to the Adobe CEP GitHub, which contains all of the extension samples and resources. If you go to CEP resources and go to Zxp Sign CMD, select one of the versions and download it for your OS. It's going to come with Zxp Sign CMD.exe, which we'll use to package up our extension. So what I'm going to want to do is wherever my Zxp file is located, I'm going to want to create a folder to paste all of my extension files in. So I'm just going to use the bundle ID name I created called com.extension.testing. And then inside of here, I'm going to paste all of my files that I had. So I'll copy and paste the files from my extension, and now we need to load up a terminal or command prompt. We'll need to navigate to wherever this base folder is that contains our zxp.signcmd, and now it contains our com.extension.testing. So I'll go ahead and cd to this location, and now we need to type in the command to sign this. I'm going to type in the name of our exe signer, zxp sign cmd, and the action we're going to do is sign these files. And after we've signed it, we need to give it the folder it's going to be signing, which is com.extension.testing, and then we're going to set the output name of these files. I'll just say extension testing _01, and the extension needs to be a ZXP, which, if you're familiar, is a type of installer or basically a repackaged zip file. And then lastly, we're going to type in the name of whatever license we're using. I've gone over how to make a free license as well as paid licenses in my previous tutorials. I'm just going to be using one of these licenses here. Just type in the name of your license file. And then, of course, you'll want to type in your password. And mine will be blurred out, of course, for privacy purposes. And once we're ready, we'll click on Enter. And if you come across any typos, you'll need to fix those before it will work properly. But once it's done, it will say signed successfully, and you should see a new file pop up here called extensiontesting.zxp. If you're just creating basic extensions and want to use the Zxp installer for your users, then you can simply stop here and have them just drag and drop the extension to install it that way. If you want to go the extra mile and use third-party applications, whether it be free or paid on Mac or Windows, to set up a more secure, trusted installer that's much more easy to use and can install things in different locations and manage other things, then the next step would be to copy and paste this file and change the extension to zip. We can simply change it to a zip file and have access to all of the extension files. And if you look inside, you'll see there's also a MIME type and a meta info folder. These are just signs that it has been signed by the Zxp Sign CMD. If you install this and modify where these folders are or change the files up, it can break the signing and basically make it not function. So the reason we sign is to make sure that the folders are staying together and nothing gets modified. After that, you'd basically extract it to a folder, and then you can use this folder to install the files in whatever application of your choice you have. I'm not going to go over the entire thing because I already have a whole tutorial on it, but for example, if I wanted to use Inno setup on Windows, I could simply put in the information to refer to this folder, and when I run it, it's going to then run through and package all of the files I've included and create an installer file. In my case, I just did it arbitrarily and saved it here. You can see I have my FVS Creative Pack installer, which is really extension testing. And now when I go through and install my extension, it'll be installed inside of our extensions folder automatically. Again, if you want a full detail on how to make those installers and all the details, check out the video on that in our extension playlist. And the same goes for Mac. You can use packages and DMG Canvas or other applications to put together a package installer and sign it on your Mac. So just to recap the distribution, put all your files together. If you want, you can save them as JSX bins and obfuscate your JS code and other things like that. And then put them into a folder, sign them using the standard Zxp Sign CMD utility, using a paid or free certification. And then if you want to go the extra mile, you can use third-party installers. Really, the last thing, it's not much more to talk about other than just testing and getting ready for extension building. You can expect to spend many hours on the silliest problems inside of extensions, as I have just in this tutorial after 3 years of extension writing. Is sometimes you're just missing a colon, a semicolon, a quotation mark, or a letter inside of a variable name that makes things incredibly difficult to find. That's one of the downsides to JavaScript, is sometimes things will just stop working. Your alert messages that were telling you how far in the code you're getting will just stop working altogether, and you have to figure out what went wrong. So sometimes it's good in the beginning to take things incrementally. As you're modifying code, make big changes, but not lots of changes. If you're making a big change, change the color of a whole element so you can see what's going on. If you're in the JavaScript, add alert messages between the lines of code to see how far you're getting. And with time, you'll get better and better at developing things, and you'll find you have strengths and weaknesses, whether it be maybe I'm not the best designer, but I'm great at the back end and making JavaScript extended communicate with JavaScript. There's plenty of things to explore and learn about in the world of extensions. And of course, it's not just limited to After Effects. You can make extensions for many applications now. After Effects just does have the most compatibility in terms of scripting and functionality, but lots of people are making cross-platform or cross-application extensions for Premiere and After Effects, and I've even seen some that are very rudimentary but have compatibility with Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator, which have just simple functions of importing files. I really hope you guys enjoyed this entire long-length, full-length development tutorial on extensions. I tried to start it with as little prepared as possible and explain as much as possible while creating something very practical that people have both requested and I think people will find useful. Of course, there are plenty of different ideas you can come up with for extensions that could be way more complicated than this, but this is just a starting off platform for medium, beginner, and advanced users to get started in extension creation. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button down below, as well as the subscribe button to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly. All of the code and links for everything here will be in the description down below, as well as a link to our Instagram where you can follow us to be notified of when new videos are coming out immediately. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to keep watching the video over and over until you understand it, or you can ask them down in the comments if you can't find the answer. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one.